Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of On the Ball. Ball stands for Best Advice and Life Lessons, a podcast show where I focus on extracting best advice and life lessons from world-class performers and leaders from various fields by deconstructing and teasing out their routines, success habits, tactics, techniques, hacks, tricks, and the best advice or life lesson that they have ever received that you can use and apply to your own life and work. I'm more interested in learning things my guests have never said or shared before. So today, I'm super thrilled to have my friend Scott Van Vliet in this episode of On the Ball. Scott is the CVP of a group called IC3 at Microsoft. In his current role, Scott leads cutting edge product and engineering org responsible for building intelligent communication platform on which Microsoft Teams, which by the way is the fastest growing business application in the history of Microsoft, and Skype are built. Before that, he was a GM at Amazon, leading new Alexa initiatives in charge of expanding Alexa's capabilities into new areas. Prior to that, Scott has played leadership roles at Mattel as CTO and VP, and also at Capgemini. We also have today a very special guest on the show, Amar Kaleem, as part of the Microsoft Giving Campaign. The Giving Campaign at Microsoft supports our employees' passion for giving, and each October, a fun and spirited employee giving campaign, a tradition since 1983, makes a significant annual impact in addition to generous giving all around the year. So Amar is my colleague. He is a principal PM in Microsoft org with expertise in enterprise voice, telephony, collaboration, working with C-level execs of Fortune 100 companies around the world. Welcome to the show, Scott and Amar. Let's play ball.
Great, Srini. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you, Srini, for the opportunity.
Hey, Scott, first, I'm sure we'll jump around a little bit and this may be a bit non-linear, but let's jump right in. I'm always curious to ask folks who join saying, hey, Scott, you have young kids. When your kids ask you, what do you do? How do you answer that? What do you say, given the complexity of what you do?
That's a great question. And I have, as you know, lots of kids. I have 6 kids. And I've been asked this question, multiple times over the years and have had interesting and different responses. I would imagine if you ask my children that today, they would say he sits in a desk and is on video calls all day. That's what they might say, as I'm sure is the same for you and for others in the situation, right? But when I've been asked this question from my kids before, I kind of break it down into this. I say, well, daddy gets paid to make decisions. And my son Liam says, well, what does that mean? I said, well, I make decisions like where we're going to invest resources, how we're going to scale our service, how we're going to add new features to our products. And so sometimes, they come to daddy and ask his opinion, and I make decisions, based on things I know. And my son says, well, I make decisions. Can I get paid too? And I said, well, and I kind of explained to him, well, there's a difference here is that, daddy spent a lot of years building software and working with products and building products for customers. And so a lot of what I do, I used to write code. I still write code in my spare time, although I'm sure I'm not allowed to check into any of our repos in terms of my coding skills these days. But yeah, primarily it's to make decisions that impact the lives of our customers, that have an impact on users, and it's informed by the 20 plus years of experience that I have.
That's awesome, Scott. That's a great way to put it. Making decisions, and I say similar things to my kids as well, but I also add a caveat saying, "Hey, Daddy makes decisions at work, but I'm not the boss at home."
I resemble that remark.
So, hey, I see that the one thing that always piques my interest is your background, people's background, and the different walks of life that people come from. I see that you have an undergrad. I was doing some research on you, Scott, before this, although we've been working for a while now. I was doing some research and I saw that you have an undergrad degree in criminal justice administration. Wait, what drove you to criminal justice and how did you end up in software technology, computer science as a career?
It's a great question, and it's a fun story. So, I've been around computers nearly all my life. My father was a software engineer, and worked on early technology in the 60s and 70s. And, I grew up around mainframe computers, and having large, early PCs in my home, and had the opportunity to tinker with and play with, computers. So I had an existing background in technology. But I never thought of myself becoming a software developer or a programmer, as we called it, as something that although I love playing games on the computer. And so I always had a proclivity towards, computers because of that. But in high school, I'm not sure if you had this experience as well, but they had these kind of college counselors and career counselors, and they came in and they gave you a test to see what type of career you would be best at. It's kind of an aptitude test, but kind of a vocational version of that. And this is at La Mirada High School here in Los Angeles in California.
Got it.
And in that test, the results came back and said, okay, Scott, based on this test, you would make a great attorney or a great engineer. And I saw that, okay, great. And again, at the time, engineer in my mind didn't mean software engineer, because we may not have called engineers software engineers back then. We called them computer scientists or computer technicians. And so I thought about engineers like, well, that's like a mechanical engineer or somebody who operates a train. And I said, okay, so an attorney, like which one makes more? And they said, well, an attorney. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to go do that. And so very flippantly, I looked at this, kind of what is the most value I could get out of my career. And again, my parents are immigrants and always wanted me to be an attorney or to be a doctor or kind of pursue one of those professional services paths. And so I just said, okay, well, I'm going to go into a career in law. And so I did research and said, well, what's the best undergrad degree to get before you go into law school? And it was study criminal justice administration. So, I'd been working again with technology and computers all along, and went to school at San Diego State University studying criminal justice. And at the time I went to school, I brought a computer with me, a 486, a 66 hertz, badass computer with a turbo button. I think if you recall, the turbo button actually made it slower back in the day.
I do.
But at the time, I'd actually been building websites, early days of Mosaic and kind of early days of HTML and the HTTP specification. I'd been building websites for bands. I played music as a kid. And so I was like, I'm going to build a website for my band. We're going to have an email address and we're going to build a guest book where people can come and post things like a forum type thing. And when I got to school, at home, I'd been using, dial-up internet. But at my university in the dorms, they actually had Ethernet. They had wired Ethernet all throughout the dorms. And it was one of the first Cal State schools to actually have this. And so I got connected with a LAN card that I brought back to school from my dad's stash, and just got obsessed with the internet. Just got obsessed with websites and, writing scripts and, connecting to other people around the planet. And while I was going to school, I started building websites for local companies. I started building websites for, the industry I'd been close to. I grew up in Southern California, was really into music and record labels and, skateboarding and surfing and snowboarding. And so I started building websites for some of the local skate and surf companies out in California. And one of them was called Volcom. Volcom's a clothing company. And I started building their websites along with my band. And as I was going through and studying, for my criminal justice degree, I realized I was making as much money, if not more money, actually, building websites on the side on my own little side hustle, than I would as a junior attorney with another 3 years of school to go get my JD. And so I made a call saying, okay, well, it's the 90s. The internet is exploding. I'm just going to go be an engineer for software, building websites. And that's when I stopped my path of going to be an attorney and fell into the wonderful world of technology. And so obviously there's lots of gaps between that end of that story and where I am today, but that's kind of how I ended up in this field.
Wow, that is fascinating, Scott. From criminal justice to being a lawyer to being in computer software. I do remember one of my first gigs was actually very similar. Scott, I was thrown into the deep end of it. I had no clue. I was fresh out of college. And the first job that I took was actually they asked me to install Novell NetWare, if you remember that.
I remember that.
And this was on a server that I had no clue or no idea in terms of what 10 base T and 10 base 2 was. But it's fascinating from there. I think I learned a lot, I would say, under pressure. I mean, I learned so fast. That was amazing. So great to know. Hey, given that and your journey from Capgemini to Mattel to Amazon to Microsoft, that's a great journey as well. Amar, did you want to ask, did you have a question about that? By the way, before you start there, Amar, what was your start like?
I went straightway from my high school into Air Force. So I was fixing runway lights and fixing planes and telecom. Never got an opportunity to think myself. But listening to Scott, I did do some websites and stuff like that. So really impressed. So what Scott question comes to my mind was listening to this fascinating story. You've been part of this computers, and you've been around computers since childhood. So there's a tech culture, right? So what is your favorite thing about that tech culture?
Well, I think the most exciting thing for me about technology is it's a liberating and democratizing thing. You know, again, in a world where, so many of my colleagues have gone to great universities and gone through great programs and had opportunities to do wonderful things. And I'm just a poor kid of European immigrants, who grew up in East LA. And obviously my parents did well for themselves and they took care of us, but I don't come from a pedigree. And yet this technology emerges that allows me to build a fantastic career without really having any pedigree or any reason, apart from the happenstance that I grew up around computers and building computers, that I could have a thriving career, right? And I see these moments happen all the time where people look at technology, and again, some of the great founders of the companies we love, including Apple and others, are those in which people defy odds to go and find success, and the technology is the democratizer. It's the thing that differentiates them, not because they chose a technology, but the technology allowed them to prove people wrong. And again, I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder, I guess, about being an underdog from stories my father has told me about growing up post World War II, coming over, not speaking English, having a German accent, even though he was Dutch, or at least a Dutch accent that sounded German, and the things that he faced. And so I always have this idea of like, well, I'm out to prove people wrong because they have an expectation about me or they have a preconceived notion about me. And when I think about technology, well, it doesn't care about my skin color. It doesn't care about my background. It doesn't care about any of those things. And I look at all the wonderful things we can build with it, and the people that I've got to meet along the way, who have come out of poor neighborhoods, who have faced racial oppression, but found their way around it through technology. To me, that's the most wonderful thing about the culture of the industry we're in, and this technology capability, is that it allows us to be who we want to be.
Awesome. So I have one comment about, this is amazing, but about one comment about the criminal justice. My high schooler, she is obsessed with criminal justice. When the first time she came back from her first class last year, she said, I need to practice to arrest you. So I got arrested by my daughter.
That's wonderful. It is a very, obviously, we've got a lot of things going on in the world right now in terms of the types of reforms that we need to put in place. But I'll tell you that my studies in criminal justice administration were really eye-opening to me. I had a professor named Admiral Stoddard, who was a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy, who taught out of San Diego State, and just did a wonderful job of kind of describing kind of the opportunity to serve others in the form of justice. And I'm excited for your daughter to pursue that path as well.
Thanks.
Great, that's a fascinating field. And Scott, hey, talking about that, right? Is there any part of the criminal justice learning that you went to school for? Did you apply any of that? Do you think it's useful? I asked that because my last guest was Walt Mossberg, right? Mm-hmm. And Walt was saying he was he said something very fascinating. He said, hey, we teach kids a lot of things in school that are pretty irrelevant, right? Beyond a certain point, they don't get you don't apply them in real life. So I'm just wondering, did you get to? I know you got to appreciate what it is, but I'm just curious. Did you get to apply that?
Well, I think the one thing that really stuck out for me from the studies in criminal justice were two things. One was the kind of sociological aspects of really trying to understand other people's perspective before forcing your own on them. And so, I think one of my personal mantras is, seek to understand before demanding to be understood, right? And so this idea of like, well, before you make judgment on someone, look to understand all the facts of the situation, look to understand all your own biases. Like unconscious bias is something that's relatively in the zeitgeist today, and it's obviously a big issue. But this is something that they were teaching us, back in the day in my studies of criminal justice, is like, don't use your preconceived notions, and try to be objective. And so I think that has really stuck with me in terms of how it shaped my thinking and the way I treat others, and also the way I look at problems for work. The other key learning was, as one of the electives that was part of the program was Philosophy 201, the philosophy of logic, which I actually ended up taking at a summer school program at Cal State Fullerton over a summer break. And that was another course that really changed my eyes around, the structure and cause and effect of even conditional structures in code are represented in philosophy. And so thinking about the world in a way of understanding the impacts of my actions, like it was really cool to kind of think about the most effective programming course for me was my philosophy course, but also one that has kind of guided how I think about fairness and how I think about treating others.
Awesome. That's fascinating, Scott. I mean, great insights on that one. Talking about going back to your career point, right? Was there a turning point that you can reflect on in your career? And also, if you were to look back, I know you came from pretty humble beginnings, right? Think about what were some of the toughest challenges that you faced growing up or in your career? How did you overcome that? What was the learning? If there's anything you can share.
Yeah, I'll actually had a chance to listen to a LinkedIn Live event with really my first official mentor, a gentleman named Chris Lord. He's somebody who brought me on to my gig at Hitachi Consulting. And one of the things that I struggled with early in my career is being somebody who taught, was basically self-taught as an engineer, had a lot of success in delivering projects and getting work done. I hadn't really worked at scale in a team. Now, that didn't mean I didn't work with other colleagues, but working on large scale projects to be effective as a team member was something I hadn't had a lot of experience with. And so when Chris brought me on to his team, he gave me a lot of coaching and feedback about, how to work and scale as a team. And so I got a lot of value from him in that. But the real kind of reflective moment for me in that experience with Chris is I started thinking about how I could be more effective in scaling with others as somebody who leads through influence. I started looking at the career path of, the VPs and the other executives in the company and kind of how they went down that path. And as an engineer, I looked at a lot of them and they had kind of a PM background. So a lot of them were either program managers or project managers, had moved into the executive ranks. And I looked at that saying, okay, well, that's my path. So as an SDE3, so to speak, using our terms today, my next step would be, okay, I've got to go get skills in program management and then move into that program management field in order to accelerate my career, right? And that's something I still hear from people today. But at the time, I started pursuing that and I wasn't very good. This is like circa 2003, where I was coming off of my A game of being this kind of architect, senior engineer who was really doing good stuff with .NET and speaking at Microsoft's conferences and whatnot, and struggling to do an effective job as a program and project manager delivering projects at one of our clients in the media and entertainment industry. And so I was really struggling with this, and so I went to Chris for help, and I said, Chris, I'm not sure I'm cut out. Maybe I've reached my maximum potential, right? Maybe I am just going to be at that ceiling of that SDE3. And Chris pulled me aside. He said, well, why do you think that? I said, well, I'm not a good project manager. And Chris goes, of course you're not. And I said, well, okay. Like, that sucks. And he goes, but that's not your core strength. Why would you think that you would be good at doing this when you know these are not your core strengths? And I said, well, I look at the career path of others and they've taken this path, so I think I have to do it. And he explained to me, well, your career path and others' career path aren't the same. And all of us have unique and different strengths. And to try to build muscle in an area that you just don't have interest in or a lot of innate skill in, it doesn't make sense to overexert yourself on something that you're not passionate about or you're not going to be good at. And so his feedback to me was like, well, just double down on the strengths that you have as an engineer. And, again, his feedback was hire for the skills you don't have. And that was like such an incredible moment in my career, because I realized like, oh, I don't necessarily have to be good at everything that kind of represents the cornucopia of skills as an executive. I can be good and deep at the things that I love and I'm passionate about and I'm good at, but I can hire for the strengths that I need where I don't have them. So, for example, I have several people that I work with today on my team, Srini, who you've met, like Jason and Mahendra and others, who are super strong PM leaders. And I rely heavily on them to do things that I'm not good at or I'm not as strong at or I don't have passion for. And that helps me become an effective leader and us an effective team. So that lesson learned, 17 years ago, is one that still sticks with me, because I don't have to worry about trying to be something I'm not. But it's okay to bring people along with me and double down on my strengths and lean into theirs.
That's fascinating, Scott. That is a great piece of advice and input actually for someone, because that is so awesome, right? You don't have to be good at everything, and you don't have to keep working on your weakness, rather keep working on your strengths. I mean, this is the same thing, even Tiger Woods, right? He did exactly that, right? In terms of reinventing himself, focusing on the strengths, as opposed to looking at what's your weakness, and also hiring for some great skills that are complementary to what you do. That's fantastic. Scott, are they talking about that, right? I mean, work and how you operate and how you work, and also your strengths. What would you say is your superpower? What do you bring to the table? What would you say is your superpower? And also, we all have blind spots. What is a bad habit that you're working on right now on the flip side?
Yeah. I think my superpower is probably, I would say, either bias for action as a kind of leadership principle or leadership concept, and then there's kind of a set of skills that come from that, which I can talk about.
Sure.
But again, I spent a lot of time at Amazon, as we've shared before, Srini. And one of the things I loved about Amazon was having the language and the metaphor of their leadership principles. And one of them was bias for action. And when I think about why it made me feel so good to think about and be part of those leadership principles, is because they generally manifest how I thought, but they put those words on paper. And when you think about the leadership principle of bias for action, in the vernacular of Amazon, is leaders have bias for action. There's few one-way doors in business, and so leaders bias for action, knowing they can undo things, and that's coupled with are right a lot in their vernacular, which is to say that the leaders are right a lot, so that when they use those the experience they have and the instincts they have to make decisions quickly, they're often right. And so one of the things that I love about that concept is that, over years of building expertise, you build instinct and you develop instinct. And a lot of people that I've encountered who have many years of experience still find themselves questioning decisions they're going to make, or working to, validate a lot of their assumptions. And unfortunately, the competitive marketplace today doesn't afford us to take our time thinking about decisions that we need to make, especially in product strategy and product execution. And so, whether it's me being a cowboy or me having developed skill, like I think my superpower there is the ability to make decisions, make them quickly, learn from them, and recognize. And this is probably the most important part about having a bias for action, is that you can recognize when you've made the wrong decision. And then knowing how to pull back and course correct, because I talk to so many people in the groups that I mentor and people on my teams where they struggle, and they struggle primarily with making a decision because they all fear what would happen if I'm wrong, or what if I make a mistake. And I think the thing I love about Microsoft's culture is we also embrace the concept of bias for action, and we don't punish people, so to speak, for making decisions that were well informed at the time, but just didn't prove to be wrong. I think Srini, you and I have been in our share of meetings with Rajesh Jha, where we've definitely made some mistakes in how we run our services or how we've made product decisions. And the thing I love about working with Rajesh is he never gets mad at us. He doesn't get angry with the individual. He gets frustrated with the outcome, but he has the respect of the individual for trying and gives us credit to continue working to improve the things we do. And an environment where you have that freedom to fail, a superpower like bias for action can thrive.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with that, Scott. On the note of Rajesh, right, one saying it sticks in my mind often that he quotes is, hey, make new mistakes. Don't make the same mistake twice. Right. Make new mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes, but don't make it again. Like, make new mistakes. And there's a lot of power in that statement, right? Which is you learn from new mistakes, but at the same time, make sure that, you learn from it and don't reoccur. The mistakes don't happen again. Okay. Hey, on the topic of bias for action, I totally agree with you. There are two things there, right? One is I always believe in you have to keep moving. I mean, being static is to basically atrophy and die, right? You keep moving, and bias for action is basically take an action. Same thing with decisions, right? Right or wrong, make swift decisions, course correct, and keep moving, as opposed to being indecisive. That's one of the lessons that I've learned. That's fascinating, Scott, that you share that. Then moving along, right? Teams. I know Teams is like, we just found some numbers, 115 million daily active users, right? Which is pretty awesome. It's the fastest growing application for us at Microsoft. And the amount of number of customers that we are helping and impacting, which is pretty awesome. So Amar, did you have a question around Teams as well in terms of Scott leads a team that actually is underpinnings for much of what we use in Teams?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was thinking, Scott, listening to you and Srini, from a decision-making standpoint and the crunch of the time and making the decision, world, as we know, have changed forever. And technology has taken the center stage and ever more greater part. What's your view of future of this? How the technologies like Teams and things play into the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, as I mentioned before, technology is that democratizer, right? It gives us the opportunity for anyone to find success. I believe the future will be one where we have demonstrated a level of confidence and comfort in executive leaderships and boards across the world that, people can be productive and work remote. There's been this stigma, and there's plenty of reports by people way smarter than me that kind of go into the science and the sociology behind this. But remote working technology and video conferencing and this kind of technology has been around for 4 decades, right? But there's always been this kind of stigma about working remote. And whether that be, I don't trust this person is doing everything they're getting done, they're playing golf on their spare time, blah, blah, blah. Whatever those reasons may have been, this pandemic has put everyone who is an information worker at a minimum in a position where, they can be productive remotely. We've had to be. And so I think, at least in my conversation with our customers and other executives that I know and internally at our company, we've realized not only can you be productive, but you can handle some of the most intense work of your career and do so remotely. Like, obviously, our teams have been working very closely together on making sure that we've scaled our services and scaled out the capabilities worldwide of Teams to handle, the incredible load of those 115 million daily active users and over 30 billion minutes of collaboration happening in the M365 suite in a single day. That requires a lot of work and scale, and we've done all of that remotely. And again, thank goodness for our partners in Azure and the people who are physically actually, essential workers who are going and racking and stacking servers and connecting switches and getting our infrastructure going and keeping it running. But the world has changed and we can't go back. The remote work is here to stay, so to speak. Now, from my opinion, does that mean that anybody who can work remote should work remote? Perhaps not. I think there's an incredible amount of stress that comes with remote work. I think there is nuance in terms of the type of work you're doing and your relative seniority and tenure with a company. We've onboarded hundreds, if not thousands, of people, in our world, Srini, over the last 6-7 months, where their experience joining Microsoft has been completely remote, and they've not met any of their colleagues physically. And I think our teams have done an incredible job of making them feel welcome. But there's something to be said for standing over the shoulder of a colleague and learning from them, or being in a conference room and having those social connections. To say, on one hand, I'm very cavalier about everything should be remote, or everything that should be remote, that ought to be able to, I should say. But I imagine a future when we get back to whatever the new normal is, will be this hybrid model. It'll be one where employees who choose to either want to spend time with their family or choose to live in different locations will want to work remote. And I think it's up to companies and leaders to embrace that and provide an inclusive environment where people can do that. And at the same time, I can't imagine there's going to be a mass exodus of people selling off their commercial real estate and no longer having offices. We see that in pockets, and that kind of makes sense. If you're a small business or a mid-sized business and your work is completely professional services or technology or something where you don't require that, that makes a ton of sense. But for large organizations, and especially those not in technology that have customer interactions and things like that, I imagine we'll see people start to go back to some semblance of getting back together. But the other thing I think will be very interesting is to see what the world of travel evolves to. Obviously, the hospitality and travel industry is probably one of the most affected by this pandemic. And I know there's a lot of government subsidies and things that are out there to try and help keep those companies afloat during this time. But I imagine that people will probably spend more money on business travel, or at least they'll spend money differently. As people work remotely, they'll still want to get together. They'll still want to see each other. So I anticipate, like, for example, in our organizations, we'll probably do more offsites where it's bringing people in from around the world to central locations. It will be less frequent, but I think those things will be part of a new normal of how people communicate and connect. Almost like, imagine, Srini and Amar, we've been to our conferences together and, gone through that experience with our customers. You can imagine that you might have that same kind of energy and excitement when you meet your colleagues, right? Yeah. So only time will tell. But I guess the key takeaway is I do think the future is not completely remote, but I think remote is here to stay.
Well said. Well said, Scott. And I think, as Satya said, right, there is 2 years of transformation that happened in 2 months.
That's right.
During the pandemic. And you can actually look around in terms of how things like healthcare, telehealth is completely, the whole model is shifted. Education and learning, how even kids do education today. I'm sure your kids, Scott, they're all on either Teams or other online tools, partaking in education online, and that's going to change perhaps forever in terms of the hybrid model itself. It's fascinating to see that. Scott, talking about meetings and gatherings and how we get together and all of that, this is one thing that I'm always curious about. Every leader has a different style, different technique, what does a Scott Van Vliet meeting look like? What does your leadership team meeting look like? How do you run meetings? Are there some tips and tricks others can learn? How do you make it more effective, especially in the online and sitting on this thing called Teams, especially?
Yeah, it's a great question. For those that have been in any of the meetings that I've been in, I'm a huge believer in the written narrative. And well, I guess maybe before I go into the how, I'm gonna go into the why. I think especially during kind of these times, we spend a lot of time in meetings. And in many cases, we go and say, hey, there's a topic we need to discuss, and so let's get a meeting on the books to discuss it. And we do so in increments of 30 minutes or an hour or longer, because that is the structure we're used to in terms of how people get together to have conversations. But in many cases, meetings get together to have a conversation that could have easily been an asynchronous conversation in email or in a channel or in a one-on-one or group chat. And so often meetings, are scheduled without an agenda, without a set of objectives and a set of desired outcomes. And so one of the things that I try to work on hard is if we have a meeting, let's make sure there's a set of objectives, there's a set of known outcomes, and there's a set of expectations in terms of who's doing what and what we expect of people when they join that meeting. So I think driving clarity around those things is super critical. It doesn't happen 100% of the time, but setting out the priority to say that this is how we want meetings to work happens. And of course, there's caveats to that where, hey, we have a status update or we have a ship room, and those are kind of structured meetings that happen. That's fine, but those also kind of have their own outcome. They have their own kind of input and output expectations. But generally speaking, I work to say, if this meeting is happening, could it not be a meeting? So that's kind of step one: is could we do this in an asynchronous way? Number two is, I believe PowerPoint is a super useful tool for sharing information in kind of the delivery of information in a talk and in a presentation. But for most of the meetings I go to, it's really about having a discussion to try and make a decision on a set of information or facts and a set of recommendations. And I've been in so many meetings where I've seen PMs or other people work so hard on putting together a great deck. And that presentation deck is 30 slides and the storytelling is super well figured out. And if you follow the narrative that comes with it, it'll be great. And then we get in the meeting with the executives, and on the second slide, the executive starts asking all of these questions because the executive wanted to ask those questions for the point of the meeting. And the reality is those questions are answered on slide 7 and slides 13 and slides 19, but we'll never get to them because the executive just jumps in. And so you've been in those, Srini, you and I've been in many of those together.
It's so
So rather than do that in those kind of discussion meetings, I focus and prefer on the written narrative. And again, this comes from, obviously was refined in my experience working across the lake at Amazon. But the idea of a narrative document being one that captures the details and the data and the context about a decision or about a problem statement or about a customer issue in the written narrative format, and one where when you join the meeting, you spend the first 10, 15, 20 minutes reading that document, does a couple of things. One, in preparing the document, it has the team do the hard work to flesh out all of the detail and understanding prior to the meeting starting. And I'm not to say that I've not been in a situation where I have some slides and I BS my way through them when I'm unprepared, but oftentimes it's very easy to put 3 points, 3 bullet points up or 4 bullet points up on a screen and then just kind of talk through it off the cuff. We have very talented people who can do that, but that may not necessarily be the thing that helps get to the decision you want. The document serves as a forcing function for people to go and do the hard work to have all the context set. And in some cases, I found myself in meetings where the meetings ended up getting canceled because the team putting them together realized that when they wrote the doc, the decision had already been made and clear, and they didn't need clarity because when they went and did the work to write the document, they discovered it. So there's a kind of a fun anecdote there. But the reality is when you go in the meeting and everyone's reading, the first couple of times you do it, it's uncomfortable and awkward because you're basically all in a Teams call and everyone's reading quietly. But the reality is that everyone by the end of that time reading the document has the same context because they've read the same document, and if written well, they all should really have the same context and be able to have a discussion about the decisions and outputs we want to drive. The other thing that it does is by having a written narrative that everyone is forced to read through in that time, it allows the executives, as you and I know, Srini, they actually can answer their own questions by finishing the document before jumping to a question they have on the first paragraph, right? And again, in my own reviews, I actually ask lots of questions in the document. And then I go back and as I'm reading, I answer them and I go and I delete the comments. And this is, again, we're using Word online. And so I'll go back and delete the comment because I've answered the question myself later in the document. And then, I think the last piece is in going through this process, it's much easier to have a memorialized kind of set of notes and context by sharing that document with comments and decisions rather than sending the deck, which may not have captured all the nuance of the changes in the meeting, and the facts of the discussion the same way a narrative with comments and action items would have.
That's so true, Scott. I mean, the point that you made about the long form. Even I used to be uncomfortable in the beginning, right? In terms of sitting quietly, silently in a call, it's awkward silence, reading through a long document, but it actually adds a lot of clarity. Long form writing actually clarifies a lot of things, and it's a skill that you have to develop. But if written well, like you said, I think it answers most of the questions that would come up otherwise, and then you can spend much of the discussion in terms of decision making, Q&A, and so on and so forth. That's fascinating. Scott, talking about moving along, we talked about team building, how you work as a leader. One of the important jobs that we hold and we do as leaders and managers is attracting and retaining great talent, right? Every leader has a different set of attributes that they look at. Can you talk to me about what are your hiring best practices? What do you look for when you hire others in leadership roles, especially? Key attributes. You talked about, hey, pedigree doesn't matter. I believe the same. I don't come from the biggest of names. But what are the skills, experience, attributes you look for when you hire great talent?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously it's a complicated topic as we think about all the things that go into making a great leader. But there's a few things that I look for when I'm interviewing candidates that help me understand whether or not this is somebody who I want to work with and lean into. The first one, frankly, is attitude. We talk a lot about aptitude in the evaluation of talent, and aptitude is an important aspect of it. Does this individual have the skill set? Do they have the aptitude? Do they have the proven experience? Depending on the role, some of that stuff is table stakes. You have to go for it. But to me, attitude is such an important part of the kind of quality of characteristics of a leader. Does this individual have humility? Has this individual made bad choices in the past, and are they willing to demonstrate those decisions and what they've learned in doing so? Interviewing a candidate and all they want to talk about is the great wins they've had and how much success they've had, without kind of recognizing or acknowledging some of the decisions they made that didn't go well. That speaks a lot to the type of person you might find yourself working with. Is that person going to run when the going gets hard? Are they going to try and hide their failures in a way that could damage customers? I think there's a lot to looking at somebody and looking at their attitude related to the humility that they have. Whether or not they're confident but not boastful is super critical. And then kind of along the lines of aptitude, does the individual have a willingness to learn? A lot of times when we write a job description and we go out and we interview and talk with candidates, people will treat the interview process as a checklist. Has this person had the experience doing this, that, and the other thing? And in the context of engineering, it's relatively straightforward to use some of that to your advantage. Does this person understand data structures? Have they developed complicated algorithms? Have they worked in transport? And you can do kind of technical assessments through whiteboarding and whatnot. But the reality is there's so much nuance to people's lived experiences that help make them effective at their job that the JD to me is more of a reference chart to the things we might want to look for, in leaning in the conversation and discovering how people make decisions, how people approach the decisions they've made, and think about the quality of their character. To me is one of the things that can make the difference between a fantastic hire that I'll work with for the next 10 or 20 years versus one that, hey, I'll hire for 6 months and they'll fizzle out. And again, 9 times out of 10, in my experience, somebody who has a great attitude outperforms somebody with the best of skill, more often than not.
That is so powerful, Scott. I totally subscribe to that. That is absolutely powerful, what you just said, in terms of aptitude and attitude. Are there any advice or best advice that you follow on the opposite end of that? Like, we always know as leaders, right? Hey, hire slowly and fire quickly. How do you manage poor performers? What are some of the things? Is that the hardest thing to do for you? Or perhaps some people do it very quickly and easily. what's the best advice, or how do you follow that?
Yeah. I think one of the things that it's super hard to give people bad news, right? And it's hard for many people, most people, it's hard to tell somebody they're not doing something correctly or they're not doing good, right? They're not doing well. But it's so important when dealing with somebody who's struggling with performance or struggling to do their job that you acknowledge those things as they happen. We often use the word that, the phrase feedback is a gift. What I find people who have performance issues and end up finding themselves in a position where, they either get put on a performance plan or, they head down that path. The behaviors they've demonstrated, or the challenges they face have been happening for some period of time, and people haven't had the courage to tell them that they're not doing well. And I think the most important part about managing someone who isn't meeting your expectations, I'm not going to say manage poor performers or manage them out, because I think that is an action assuming intent versus an action assuming how do I help manage the performance of somebody to perform better, right? Because I've definitely had to manage people out, but the approach I take is just different, right? It's about what are the things we're doing to identify people who are struggling early, give them feedback and actions to address it early, and have a constant and frequent feedback loop with those individuals to let them know whether or not they're succeeding or failing. And multiple times in my career, I've had situations where somebody wasn't performing at expectation. I took the time and energy to invest in those individuals and say, okay, well, here you're not working out, and here's the things that you're not working out on. And those people became my top performers because the context in which they weren't performing was important. They weren't performing because they were working on something they didn't have experience in, and the people who knew those code bases or knew the things they were working on were gone in the company, and that individual didn't have a supportive manager, right? And so without knowing that context, I would have just saw this person on a list of people who are below performance expectations and said, okay, we got to manage them out. And so I think that genuine human care is so critical, no matter what level in the organization. And I think a focus on trying to get the feedback to the individual early, and to give that feedback frequently to try and help them.
That is such an excellent point, Scott. I think it's the point is not like, hey, how do you manage poor performers out? But I think there's a lot more to it in terms of recognizing and investing time, like you said, right? People don't perform poorly because they want to perform poorly. They're struggling because it could be any number of reasons. One of the things that I learned from Jeff Weiner, CEO of LinkedIn, who's now the chairman of LinkedIn, which is a very powerful concept. And he said, hey, the most important things about leadership is compassionate leadership, being able to understand it's not just empathizing with what's happening, but what action are you taking as a leader? And that could be giving feedback, that could be understanding where the struggle is from, and making sure that your job as a leader is to elevate that person and their vision and their strength and their capabilities for the long term. That's so awesome. Scott, are there any, just getting into a little bit of a fun Q&A here, switching gears again, are there any common misconceptions about you that people have misconceptions of?
Yeah. So I'm generally known as a pretty extroverted, bombastic, friendly guy, right? And I definitely, I
Is that a misconception?
Well, I'm going to tell you that. So here's the thing, and it's an oddity. So I love talking. I like hearing myself talk, blah, 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 all the things you'd expect from an extrovert. But there's one context in which I behave. Steve Saxon, who's a colleague of ours, explained to me this concept of being an ambivert. There's one concept in which I'm totally introverted, and that's on airplanes. So you could imagine, Scott, I know you sit on an airplane, you're just going to start hamming it up with the person next to you, right? Yeah. Making lifelong friends. Yeah. When I get on the plane, I've got my AirPods in, I've got my laptop ready to go. And I'm like, I don't want to talk to anybody. I want to get my work done. I want to watch my movies. I want to sleep. And people would assume, like, and I've flown with our colleagues before, going overseas and whatnot. And, I think maybe it was VJ was like, man, you're not very friendly on the plane. And I was like, I got my thing. Like, I'm on the plane. I put on my pajamas. I'm going to sleep. And so that may be one misconception, is that I definitely am an extrovert, but in certain contexts, I like the introverted aspect of my personality.
That's so funny. I'm laughing because I'm not an extrovert, but at the same time, I can relate to the plane thing, right? I get on a plane. I don't want to talk to anyone. I just want to just focus. Yeah, open a book and read and listen.
That's right.
Right. Hey, talking about AirPods, Scott, I think it was one of my best investments that I made. I think what $100 or less purchase that has most impacted your life? It could be during pandemic or otherwise. What is that? What would that be?
It's a great question, and I've bought myself lots of gadgets over the years, and very specifically, during the pandemic. And I've spent a bunch of money on microphones and cameras, and that's been a lot of fun. But I will tell you, the one thing that's around $100, that's a set of things that I bought that has really changed my life, is I bought a spool of Cat6 cable, a container of self or crimping ends, or easy crimp ends, and a crimper. And I started running wire through my house to have all of my computer hardwired, all of my kids' laptops hardwired because they were doing school remotely. And that has really changed the quality of our lives. Obviously, I get in debates with people about, well, Wi-Fi 6 is going to solve all your problems. Maybe, if I'm lucky enough for all the devices to support Wi-Fi 6 right now. But I will tell you that the Wi-Fi is awesome. But I just, when we have so many video streams going on, I've got 6 kids, 5 of whom are at home, and they're also on video calls concurrently as we're doing this podcast. Having that wired connection just makes things so much easier. And of course, my 15-year-old son loves the fact that he has hardwired internet for his gaming, because he has super low latency, and he can crush it at Fortnite and the other multiplayer games he plays.
That is a pretty awesome one. I haven't heard of that before, even though I have wired and I have, wired computers everywhere. But that's a very good purchase, Scott. I think I'll get a model number from you later on.
Yeah. Although I do recommend be smart about going up in the attic and having someone hold your ladder. I did have a near miss of falling out of the attic because the ladder wasn't secured correctly. So I do encourage either, if you are skilled in running stuff through your attic, make sure you have at least 2 people, or hire somebody to do that.
Got it. Good advice.
Hey, Scott, on the flip side, what is your guilty pleasures? What expensive toys you buy?
Ooh, I would say from a activities perspective, my biggest guilty pleasure is probably scrolling and trolling on Reddit. But in terms of guilty pleasures, I'm a bit of a collector of musical instruments. And so there's this website called Reverb. I spend way too much time there looking at guitars and basses and instruments that I want to buy. And I have some instruments hanging on my wall that I play in the meetings. And then I guess the guilty activity is that oftentimes during meetings, I will have a guitar strapped around my neck below the camera view, and I'll be playing along during the meeting to keep my hands occupied.
That's pretty
awesome. May I ask you what car you drive? Because I'm an automobile fanatic, so that's why I'm asking that.
You should ask Joe Rafferty that.
Oh yeah, Joe's got his drums. I keep telling him we've got to build a virtual jam session in Teams so he and I can play.
You just bought a Lambo.
Yeah, but my most recent acquisition of a guitar was the Ernie Ball Music Man. It's a Stingray guitar, but it's the Dustin Kensrue model, the Artist Series. He's a guitar player for a band called Thrice, which is a group of musicians we used to play with back in the day when I was young. And that guitar sounds amazing.
Got it. Scott, who are your role models or mentors? Do you have any role models or mentors? The 2 or 3 people that have been most influential to you now, before, anytime?
Yeah. So I think, so Chris Lord is one of my career mentors I mentioned earlier in the podcast. He's still somebody I look up to dearly and appreciate every lesson he taught me. Another role model and hero of mine is my grandfather. My grandfather, my grandmother on my father's side, came to this country with nothing, left, a war-torn, post-World War II Europe to come to this country and, sacrificed a lot to give us a future in America. And so I look at the contributions that they've made, and that makes me super proud of our family name and the things we've done. I'm also super proud of my dad, and look up to him in terms of the lessons he taught me about, standing up for myself and for people I care about, most importantly. And then maybe lastly, I while my mom was alive, I obviously I loved my mother dearly, but I don't think I gave her enough credit for the person I am today based on who she was and the role model she set for me. My mom was a hairstylist and had a salon for 40 years and worked as a stylist for 50 years. Wow. And as a young boy, I learned a lot of my entrepreneurial skills by going with my mom to work and going to the beauty salon. And, I used to go to the salon and sweep up hair and clean perm solution out of rollers, and I get paid a quarter and this and that from the ladies bringing them coffee. But one of the things that I now recognize as an adult is, I think my gift of gab, if you will, came from my mom, because she sat, had her customers sit in that chair, and, she would listen to all their stories, hear about all of their pain and anguish and personal challenges, and had advice and feedback to give to every one of them. And most of her clients she had for over 30 or 40 years. And when I think, back to her funeral, how many of those clients came to her funeral and talked about the experience of what it was like to be one of my mom's friends and how important they felt. Every year they got a birthday card, every Christmas they got a gift. And my mom was just an amazing friend. And so I look back on her very differently now. Obviously, I loved her as my mom, but now I look back at her as somebody who is a role model for me about being a great friend without actually knowing it. And so in many ways, she is one of my heroes, and I look up to her and want to leave a good legacy in her name for how I treat others.
This is amazing.
Scott, that's amazing. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I do the show, why I do it. I mean, the amount of learning, what you just shared there, Scott, there is so much gold there. It's full of nuggets, right? I mean, all those learning comes from any number of sources. That's fascinating, Scott, what you just shared. Thank you for sharing that. Of course.
And I was gonna say, Srini, that I can relate to it because I've done similar things because my mom was a hairstylist too.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Oh, wow. There you go. I didn't know that. Cool.
Although I don't think my mom would have approved of my COVID beard. I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah, I know. COVID has changed all of us, right, into different ways. Hey, Scott, switching gears again from that, I want to ask, what's your favorite book? Usually I do ask in terms of, hey, are there any particular books that you gift often to people? And because that tells what kind of book or what would that book be, and we can learn from. And what is the last book that you read that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I would say that Malcolm Gladwell is one of my favorite authors, and so his series of books, Blink, Tipping Point, Outliers, and David and Goliath. These are all fantastic books, and one of the books I often give out is Outliers.
Got it.
In describing these kind of archetypes, and I believe Outliers and may describe, I think, Joe Flom's interviews in that, and I believe that's the book in which he talked about the 10,000 hour rule, which again, I know he's talked about that not being a literal concept, but I think a recognition of understanding that there's different archetypes of leaders, it played a very special place in my heart, because as he talks about mavens, connectors, and salesmen or salespeople, it made me recognize that, okay, there's not one formula for success, and it kind of validated the hypothesis I had from Chris and from other leaders. And so I used that book as a way to get people into Gladwell, number one, and number two is a way to open people's minds about the my physical fitness is not good these days, but I had a personal trainer who said, get the effing work done, right? As a metaphor of finding your way to fitness. And I find so much of what people are doing in business is trying to find shortcuts and ways of just getting advantage of the system and just trying to win without putting in the work. And I'm not one of those people who say you have to be here a certain number of years before you get promoted. I don't believe in any of that. But I do believe that success can come from hard work. And so the idea of mastering your craft requires time and iteration. To me, that was super important.
Cool.
And I think, a recent book, and the name escapes me, but Gladwell's latest book, where he actually talks about systemic racism and the default of truth. I can't believe I'm looking at my bookshelf, but I bought it as an Audible book, and I'll have to come back and annotate the podcast. But Gladwell's latest book, Talking to Strangers. Sorry,
Talking to Strangers.
Exactly. Sorry. And it's funny because I listened to it on a drive from Washington to California, and hearing the first story, about this poor woman who hung herself, who was pulled over. She was African American, and the idea of the sources of our preconceived judgments about people and our default to truth or failure to default to truth. Like, that book was just incredibly eye-opening to me about my own preconceptions and prejudgments. And so that's another book that I think is a worthwhile read.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think all the Malcolm Gladwell books are fantastic read, a lot of learning. The one thing from Tipping Point was, the whole concept of broken windows, right?
Yep.
I mean, talk about bias for action. The broken windows concept, mavens, connectors, and salespeople. Fascinating read. Amar, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so talking about bias for action and attitude, so that was really resonating. But I wanted to ask Scott that how do you feel about in a leader's trait, empathy and achiever in contrast to these?
Yeah, I mean, I would say having empathy is the paramount aspect of being an effective leader. And again, I mentioned that earlier on one of my personal mantras of seek to understand before demanding to be understood. And a lot of people confuse sympathy with empathy, right? And I think it's critically important to recognize and understand that having sympathy for somebody isn't the same as being empathetic to their situation and giving people consideration for situations they may face, or biases you might have of yourself about their experience. And so I think being genuine and being human when you're working with other people who are also human is just so important to be effective as a leader. That doesn't mean, one of the leaders I worked for, a guy named Ethan Evans, who was an executive at Amazon who's recently retired, talked about, Scott, it's okay to be friendly, but you don't always have to be friends. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes people will also confuse empathy with trying to gain the friendship and adoration of the people you worked with in that context. And that's not necessarily empathy. Empathy is one of those aspects of trying to understand someone and give them considerations for their uniqueness, but it doesn't require friendship, so to speak, or it doesn't require trying to get people to like you. It just, frankly, it's just being human, right?
Great. So, this goes back to what you had earlier said. So hire the people for what you can train them, not for what their skills,
That's
they
right.
have, right?
That's
yeah.
right.
So that's amazing. So I can totally relate to it. Thank you so much for that.
Of course.
Hey, Scott, I think we are nearing the end. I have two questions. One is, we talked about how you got into the tech space at Microsoft. Obviously, the stuff that we currently do is so impactful. What advice would you offer someone, whether someone who is starting out or, there are very young engineers coming into Teams and Microsoft engineering and product roles. What would you recommend? What advice would you give to them who are starting out or trying to move up?
It's a really interesting question, because I think, my answer probably would have been different in January, right?
Yeah.
I think the biggest piece of advice is to have patience with yourself. a lot of people I've talked to in kind of our onboarding cohorts, the folks that we've been bringing on, and they're facing some really interesting challenges. When I think about, again, a lot of what we do is we look at the lens, and this goes back to what Amar was saying earlier about empathy. We look at the lens of the world through our own experiences, right? Our own lived experiences inform how we look at the world. And so as a father and a husband, I think about my experience being at home in this pandemic reflected on, okay, my kids are home all the time. I'm home all the time. My wife is probably annoyed that I'm home all the time, but it's the commonality of we're schooling our kids at home, or kids are running in during a meeting. Haha. This is the lived experiences. But for a lot of our new hires, they're recent college graduates. They may have just moved to the Seattle or Puget Sound area. They may be living with a roommate they'd never met. And they may have aspirations to, find someone to date, to go out and make friends. And moving to a city where don't know anyone, and you're in an apartment with a roommate who you may hate because you didn't know them and you're sharing that apartment with them, where you can't go out to bars and you can't go out to restaurants, or at least before, when this whole thing started. What an incredibly challenging time for these young folks starting their careers. And so, I think, what I think about the advice I give to them is to have patience. It's okay to say, I don't think I can do this. I may need to move back with my family, or I may need to make changes to how I think about it. Or if that person is not able to kind of cope with the complexities of onboarding, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to take time and slow down and figure out how to adapt to this new normal. Because again, I think especially when you look at the people that we're hiring, and a lot of companies are hiring, they're graduating from top schools. They're often the head of their class and this and that. And so they're used to being overachievers, and they're used to having to work super hard to overachieve to be successful. And coming in, they're probably going to want to replicate that. But I would say just know that we get it. We are being considerate. We're considerate of your time. And we're considerate of the timing, I should say, of your onboarding. And so have a bit of patience with yourself. Have a bit of patience with your situation.
That is sound advice, Scott. Awesome advice. In fact, given this current situation, right? I mean, that is very relevant, I would say. Thank you for that. Scott, before we wrap up, this whole show, I think you had chock full of advice and lessons. Is there any best advice that you ever got, and the lesson that you learned you want to share, the biggest and the best, if there is one?
Yeah, I think I'll tell you one piece of advice that I got. I think the advice I shared earlier about not trying to be someone you're not, so to speak, all right, in the form of my skills as a program manager aren't as strong as my skills as an engineer. I think that's probably one of the pieces that have stuck with me the most. But I'm trying to think if there's another nugget that I can share with you that would be more impactful than that particular takeaway for me. And I may not have one. I have lots of other.
Yeah, that's okay. I think you shared quite a bit, I'm sure. There's a lot of good advice in this show, Scott. Thank you. On that note, thanks a lot for taking the time to be on the show. Amar, thank you so much for joining us today. Amar, do you have any final questions or thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank you and Scott. This has been a treat. What a way to start the weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Srini, and Amar, thank you for your participation in this and the Give campaign, and Srini for having me.
You bet. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Have a great weekend.
Bye.